So this video that I'm doing today was kind of inspired by Vendi when she asked me a question by Q&A, and she asked what are some of my favourite bookish buzzwords, and I kind of came up with like a bit of a half-assed answer for that because, you know, there was a lot of questions, had a lot of things to do, and then recently Debbie made a video in which she was talking about the sort of bookish tick boxes that, you know, make her pick up a book, the things that really gravitate her towards some books and what she loves reading about books. And then Miriam then went and did a tag, the bookish box or the bookish buzzword tags, in which she tagged me and then kind of talked about her in relation to some questions. She talked about some of the books that she, you know, picks up for specific reasons, like what parts of books she's kind of attracted to. So whilst I'm here with my knife making a fruit salad, I wanted to talk about sort of the ingredients that make a book good for me. So like the things that I personally really like. So I thought I'd talk about kind of like the book that I'm currently reading, which is Strike Your Heart by Amélie Nothomb. Now I got sent this by Europa Press from work. I requested it, and this book I was very much drawn to because of the themes that relates to sort of childhood. I really love like adult fiction, which kind of like relates to childhood, and particularly like the memory of an adult. Because I don't know, I find it absolutely fascinating, and I think it's something that we all do. We all sort of think about our childhoods through the perspective of an adult and kind of notice how different it might be from when we interpreted it then as a children and to how we interpret it now. And it's something that absolutely fascinates me. With this book, it's kind of talking about a mother who is living and surviving of the fact that she is beautiful and everyone is envy of her. So when she has a child, and everyone starts saying how beautiful the child is, she kind of ends up getting really jealous of the child. Up to where I am now, we're actually getting the child's perspective of the impact that this is having. And it is told from like a 2-year-old's perspective, kind of, but I know the story develops and the character gets older and looks how this childhood impacts her adulthood. Another example would be Black Swan Green. Now this example is almost perfect because for me that one represents a reflection of my own childhood, and it was really beautiful to see how that reflection, even though it's a completely different story from things that I went through as a child, that reflection made me kind of interpret my own childhood in a different way and kind of feel a little bit more connected, particularly to the fact that it is by one of my favourite authors, and it was just a really beautiful tale, and that was something that kind of really attracted me to that book. Now this is something that I did talk about in my Q&A video for Vendi's question, and that was like the sort of allegorical tales. Now I picked up The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro because this is like, it is a almost allegorical fable about what it means to sort of forget about things, and then kind of like the unending love that can arise and the way that love is different amidst different scenes. And what I particularly liked about the sort of allegory behind this book is the way that it's a very like sort of slow-paced book. It's very subtle in the story that it's telling and the meaning that it's giving you. And, you know, I absolutely love this in literature. I love these sort of allegorical tales which you can get one story and that's the story that you're directly told and you can enjoy that story, but you can also enjoy it for another story that it's telling which you might not get. And that's absolutely fine. That doesn't impede your enjoyment of the book at all. But if you do get it, it kind of increases that sense of that story's worth and increases that wonder that is that book. So I kind of got a selection of a few also that, you know, I find connect with concepts and meanings which are actually very meaningful to me personally, and that's something that, you know, will always draw me in, whether it be sort of repressed identities or surviving cultural societal shifts. These sort of allegories that really focus on life, death, being together, and the beauty of like humanity are ones that kind of really kind of draw me in, and I am absolutely fascinated by. So then I wanted to look at sort of places, the way that Debbie looked at places. Now Debbie, you know, kind of looked at books set in places or books by authors from specific places, and I also am very much drawn to Japanese literature, like books that are either set in Japan or by Japanese authors are ones that just really get to me. I've got here the Nakano Thrift Shop by Hiromi Kawakami, because this book just, it's so simple in its telling, and you know, it's so wonderful and joyful in a way. It kind of looks at family and objects and sort of life in Japan at the time, like a contemporary look at it. And I've always been fascinated by Japanese culture, particularly Japanese history, and kind of the way that their culture has changed and the way that their culture is right now, ever since the Edo period, where they sort of opened up to the world, and the impacts perhaps in the most recent centuries of how Western culture has begun to seep into their sort of society. Now, I love Japan. I have been to Japan a handful of times, and you know, the last time I went, it was with a group of friends from Hong Kong, and we had like an absolutely wonderful time. There's something just about the place that was absolutely magical, so every time I read a book that's set in Japan, I'm always reminded of that magical feeling, that wonderment of a place that you can love so much, and you know, it really does mean a lot to me, and I am always drawn, if a book is by like a recent Japanese author, or a Japanese author I haven't heard of yet, or it's by a Western author also but set in Japan, because that really gives you a unique experience of seeing like the Western perception of culture, especially like David Mitchell, if that author has lived there in Japan, and how their perception might have changed through living there. It's just something that absolutely fascinates me. And of course, like with my own personal experiences with the country, it's something that, I don't know, I think will always kind of speak to me, perhaps. So then I have another place, and that is Latin America. It's a continent, basically. But just the Latin American sort of canon, the literary canon, is wonderful, and I'm still kind of new to it, and yet it's drawing me in and really like making me want to learn more. I have like a fascination with some of the cultures from Latin America, particularly the Oaxacan culture from Mexico, just because the art scene there and their like crafts and everything is just amazing. And then of course I went to Buenos Aires, I went to Sao Paulo, and had a fantastic time with just lots of there's just such a massive mix of people in Latin America, like, and they are all so very different and lively, and have sort of cultures that they actually want to, you know, sing and dance about, and it's just so wonderful. And seeing that in the literature, struggling against the historic violence that of course has happened in Latin America, and you know, not even long ago, the recent history of Latin America and the way that that's kind of impacted the literature really fascinates me. I've got here 11 Minutos by Paolo Coelho. Now, I've read 11 minutes in English, and now this is one of those books that just gave me like a different perspective on the sort of life that could be led within Latin America. There is so many different landscapes in Latin America. You have like the Amazon forests, you have like these vibrant cities on the coastlines, and you have like the Andes and everything. You even have the most southern point in the world in Latin America, and you know, it just, there's so much to explore, so many places to explore, and so much to see in literature. And you have these sort of this magical realist literature canon from, you know, from authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his contemporaries. And then you see the way that that has actually impacted so many authors around the world, and that is incredible. So even like the Luis de Bernieres books that I'm currently in the middle of reading, he is just so in awe and inspired by this writing style and this magical realism style. And to see what impact that those writings have had, and even when you read current modern day Latin American writers, their works, and see the way that they are still inspired, and the way that, you know, this movement of this magical realist, this true gritty sort of allegorical stories again has impacted the books that we are still getting today. And I think that's really powerful and really special. I then finally wanted to talk about fantasy, because I was looking at my fantasy books, and I do really enjoy fantasy, but I was like, oh, but what is it about fantasy that draws me in? Is it just simply fantasy? But I was like, but that's quite a boring buzzword, and I don't think that really does it justice. I picked up Ink and Bone by Rachel Caine because I thought, you know, this one is one of those fantasy books that I went in with very few expectations, and came out ending up loving it, yet still haven't managed to read the next two in the series. And even my mum really enjoyed this book. This one is sort of set in the Library of Alexandria if it hadn't burned, and the way that sort of knowledge is power in this sort of society, and like the kind of the role that knowledge plays almost as like a cult or a religion, and that, you know, to sort of go against what the Library of Alexandria is saying is heresy. And then it kind of clicked. And I think with fantasy, the buzzword would be sort of imagination. Now, it's not really imagination like, because of course all fantasy requires imagination, and it's not imagination on the reader's behalf, but the imagination of the author that has gone in to create such a fully rounded world, and with fully rounded characters. I think, you know, a fantasy book that just has that world and has those characters, which is both magical and beyond my own imagination, yet at the same time very real, is something that, you know, really pulls me into a fantasy book. So for example, The Secrets of Jinshay, it's inspired by an historic China, but it is just still so, yet the fictional elements of it and the imagination of Alexander that went into it to create a really well-rounded world. And it's the same with Natural History of Dragons. It's kind of like a travel memoir from a Victorian woman who was trying to get into science, yet at the same time it's not. There's an imaginary world, and such a perfectly described and perfectly complete world, and the imagination of that author putting in all those sort of powerful images and powerful like world buildings, like and all those powerful world building tools that go into them, just really is what draws me in. I don't want to read like fantasy that's the same as every other fantasy book that's out there, that just kind of uses a half-assed world that everybody is kind of using. I don't want to read a fantasy book where there's a full world to explore, but the characters are just so one-dimensional. And I don't want to read a fantasy that just fulfills a reader's desire of what the author thinks the reader wants. And so when a fantasy book has that hook, has that imagination that kind of drives the story and the book forward, that's when you get the real magic. So they are, I guess, my ingredients of what makes a good book for me. You know, it's my taste, it's the books that draw me in, it's not what makes a good book, full stop. That would be impossible to ever say, because there's no such thing as a universally good book. But these are some of the sort of buzzwords or tick boxes that kind of make me attracted to a book. I would also talk about the artistry of covers, but I don't think that's quite what these sort of videos are about. Anyway, thank you for watching.